Hello everyone, this is Charlie from the Bloomingdale Public Library, and today we're going to be discussing geometry nodes, which is a feature within Blender. If you didn't know what Blender is, it is a fun, free, professional level 3D modeling application. Part of the reason I like to do these classes is to hopefully inspire people to create some original 3D digital art and then bring it to life with our 3D print service here at the library. If you wanted to learn more about that, you can go to mybpl.org and check under the Services heading. So what is Geometry Nodes? Geometry Nodes is an object modifier in Blender, which, like any other modifier, can be accessed in the Properties panel. I'll show you where. The Geometry Node modifier works by sending the model's geometry data through a group of nodes, which performs various functions on it. When I refer to a model's geometry, that's its vertices, edges, and faces. So the geometry data is referring to the numbers that describe those things. So numbers like coordinates or rotation would be examples of geometry data. Working with geometry nodes is done in the Geometry Node Editor, which is where we'll spend most of our time. It is part of a procedural workflow which will allow you to automate the modification of a model's geometry in a reusable, non-destructive way. Let me explain to you what I mean. Basically, anytime you add an object modifier to an object in Blender, you're adding a little piece of code which alters the way it looks. Geometry nodes is a modifier comprised of smaller modifiers. So if you think of each geometry node within the geometry nodes modifier, those are all little code blocks which you can put together to create entire programs, essentially building your objects out of a kind of code instead of doing it manually. So when I say reusable, basically if you were to use a geometry node group to turn a primitive plane into a forest, you can take that same geometry node group and apply it to a sphere to get yourself a little forest planet, or apply it to a robot to give yourself a forest robot. It's up to you. Once you have that geometry node group made, you can apply it to whatever. When I say non-destructive, I mean you can create your geometry node group and then start moving your nodes around and alter the way things look and then set them back, and you'll still get the same results as you did before. You won't actually wreck anything by moving things around. At the same time, if you want to get your primitive plane or sphere back, you can just go ahead and delete the modifier and you're back to square one. So you can have multiple geometry node modifiers, and their stacking order matters just with any other object modifier. So it's not common to do this because it can get kind of confusing if you have multiple geometry node modifiers stacked on top of each other, so don't do that. And when I say stacking order matters, as it does with all the other object modifiers, basically if I were to tell you to walk 10 steps forward, then turn left, it would be different if I were to tell you to turn left and then take 10 steps. You'd wind up in a completely different spot. That's how object modifiers work. Geometry nodes are relatively new to Blender, so it's under constant development. Nodes may be changed or added with each update. In one tutorial I was viewing, the comment section was filled with people talking about how a certain popularly used node has changed names in the last year, and in another forum they were discussing how a whole batch of geometry nodes will probably be deemed obsolete and removed in a future patch. So again, it's getting a lot of attention right now, so it's in constant flux, but that's a good thing. Geometry nodes are not difficult to work with, but learning what a node does or finding the node you need lends itself to research rather than experimentation. So I'm not discouraging you from goofing around and trying to learn through trial and error, but it's been my experience, and it's been echoed by several other tutors, that you shouldn't frustrate yourself. If you get stuck, do not hesitate to go onto the internet and do some research and see what other people might have done in the past to try to help yourself along. For whatever reason, a lot of the nodes just are not intuitive. Okay, so let's start looking at some geometry nodes. First step to applying geometry nodes to your object is to make sure your object is selected. And we'll go ahead and use the default cube. Once your object is selected, you need to add the geometry node modifier. There's at least two ways to do that. One way would be to go to the Properties panel, go down to the wrench. It says Modifiers when you roll over it. Click on that. You'll see we don't have any modifiers yet, so let's go ahead and click on Add Modifier. And from the list, you choose Geometry Nodes, kind of in the middle. We now have a Geometry Nodes modifier. However, we don't have any geometry nodes in there, so nothing's really changed. From here, you can go ahead and click on New in the Geometry Node modifier in the Properties panel, or you can do it from the editor. To get to the Geometry Node editor, you go to the little symbol up in the upper left here. It says Editor Type. Click on that. And in the first column, you'll see Geometry Node Editor. But I'm not going to do that here because I actually want to keep the viewport open. So instead, I'm going to repurpose the timeline. So I'll bring that up a bit. In the upper left corner here, we'll click on that. Click on Geometry Node Editor. And this is it. And you'll see, once again, there's nothing there yet. So you can either click on New over in the Properties panel or click on New at the top of the Geometry Node Editor. And either way, you'll get your default nodes. It's basically an input and an output. To navigate around the Geometry Node Editor, you hold down the middle mouse button and drag in order to move around. And you zoom with the mouse wheel up and down to zoom in and out. So now that we've got everything here, we're set to start adding nodes. Adding nodes to the Geometry Node group is relatively easy. All you got to do is go up to the menu here, click Add, and then find your node. You'll notice most of these categories have subcategories, so it can be kind of hard to find what you're looking for. And if you happen to know what you're looking for, you can just go ahead and click on the search bar at the top and type it in. So it just so happens I'm looking for transform geometry, but we'll go about it the long way. Another way to pull up the menu is with Shift A. And again, it's the same thing. If what you see doesn't match what I've got up here, again, remember that Geometry Nodes is going through a lot of development right now, so things are constantly being added, removed, and rearranged. So it's quite likely that you're seeing something different than I've got right here. So the transform geometry is actually under Geometry, Operations, Transform Geometry. Once you select that, you'll be dragging the node around even without a mouse button pressed. To add it to the data flow, all you got to do is click while you're over the data flow. That's the line that connects the nodes. And it should automatically connect itself. I believe it connects the colors going from the top down. So if there are more than one socket available, it'll probably take the top one. If I wanted to remove the node from the data flow, you can just make sure it's selected and either right click and delete it, or you can select it and hit delete or X. Same thing. I'm hitting Control Z to undo that. You can also hold the Alt key down, click and drag, and you'll keep the node in the editor, but you'll remove it from the data flow. So another way to go about things is by manually dragging the data flow line around. So if you want to disconnect things, you go from right to left. You can actually connect from right to left or left to right. But if you already have a line connecting two nodes and you try to go from left to right again, you're just going to come up with a different output. So you can output more than one data flow from a node, but a node can only accept one. And you can only go more than one with specific nodes. And I'll show you one of those later. So I'll go ahead, click and drag this guy onto the data flow. Another thing you can do, especially if you have a whole bunch of data flows you'd like to cut off at once, you can hold down the Control key and then use the right mouse button and you'll start cutting. So you'll see if you've got a whole bunch of lines, you can cut through all of them at once, going that route. We'll go ahead and connect that back together. You'll notice if this data flow gets cut off that our object actually goes missing from the viewport. That's because if we don't have any output, In the geometry node editor, we don't have any output on the viewport either. Once you connect that, again, it comes back. So it's kind of neat that you can see your geometry node changes in the viewport in real time. So now that we have a node here, we can go ahead and play around with it. As you see, as I start messing around with the values, again, we see the changes in the viewport in real time. If you wanted to change these values outside of the geometry node editor, instead you could do it from the properties panel. What you can do is go ahead and click and drag one of the sockets over to this empty socket here in the group input, and you'll notice that the data values are now available in the geometry node modifier in the properties panel. So if I were to just go ahead and close this, we'll set it back to the timeline. As you can see, I can still move things around in the modifier window over in the properties panel, which is kind of neat. Not only that, but if it makes sense to do so, you can also rename that input. Let's go ahead and go back to the editor here. So if you go over on the right side here and go to group, you'll see what all your inputs and outputs are for the whole node group. And if we click on translation here, since that is where our input is, where it says name, you can go ahead and call it something else. Type in input, hit enter. You'll see over here in the geometry node modifier, it says input now. If you decide you're done with it, you can go ahead and disconnect. Go ahead and disconnect that data flow there. But when you do that, it stays. And that's kind of annoying. And to get rid of that, again, you got to go back to this group tab over in the geometry node editor, select it, hit the minus, and now it is gone. Another thing you can do with our node here is color code it, which with a single node here probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but once things start getting into the dozens or maybe even hundreds of geometry nodes, it makes a lot more sense. You'll probably start grouping and framing things as well, which we'll get into in a bit. So to do that, we go to the Node tab, and well, we can label that as well, so let's do that. So we'll just call this Practice Node. As you see, it changes the title there. And then you click on color, and you see immediately it goes to like an almost whitish gray. If you click on the little down arrow next to color, click on this colored full bar, and you can select whatever color you want. If you want to undo that, just uncheck the color bar, and you're back to square one. So that is a little bit you can do with a single node. We'll start adding some nodes and make this a little bit more complicated. So next I'd like to discuss how to organize nodes into frames and groups. However, first we're going to need a few more nodes to work with. Now typically you'd use these techniques as your node count gets into the double and triple digits. However, we're not going to be going nearly that high today. Still, I think you'll get the point. So we could use a little bit more space. One way we can do that is to hit the N key. That'll collapse the panel on the right. Tap it again to bring it back. And we're going to stretch our nodes out a bit. We're going to do this demonstration by splitting our cube into two. And we're going to do that by taking the transform geometry node. Make sure it's selected, hold down Shift, and tap D. You'll notice that my mouse cursor changed shape, and as I start moving the mouse around, I have a duplicate node. So that is how you duplicate your nodes, is with Shift D. So for the data flow on the top, we're going to move the cube over to the left, and the data flow on the bottom, we're going to move the cube over to the right. So we can see the cube on the right. We're going to need to connect the data flow. You'll see once I do that, the top data flow is dropped, and vice versa. So that is because the geometry socket on the group output only accepts one input at a time. So what this calls for is the magical join geometry node. So we'll go to under add, geometry, join geometry. We'll stick that guy over on the right here. And you'll notice that its input socket is bigger than the others. And that is to indicate that it can accept more than one input. And sure enough, once I connect the other cube, we can now see them both at the same time. So it is a very useful node that you will probably use a lot. So next, we're going to distinguish these cubes from one another. And with the top data flow, let's go ahead and add an extrude node. So we're going to go to Add, Mesh, Operations, Extrude Mesh, and plop that down right there. And you see, once I do, we've got the faces extruded on the cube on the right. So if you wanted to change the extrusion, you can go ahead and go to the offset scale, play around with that a little bit. I think that's fine. And that's all we're going to do with the data flow on the top. So one thing we can do right off the bat to help organize things a little bit is to collapse these nodes. And you do that by clicking the little down arrow next to the label at the top of the node. You see, once I do that, all you have is the label and the sockets. So now that we did that, we can bring this guy up a little bit. And for the cube on the right, we're going to randomize the rotation. And we'll do that with the random value node. So we'll go to Add, go to Utilities, and select Random Value. Let's zoom in a little bit. You can see right now it holds a float value and its socket is gray. If you wanted to see what some of the other data type colors look like, you can go to Integer. You see it turns green. Vector is blue, which is probably what we want. Boolean is kind of a lavender. So setting it back to float, we can go ahead and attach that to rotation, even though the data types don't match. Although in this case, we are getting the red line, which means that the data flow is in between incompatible sockets. And this is kind of a weird instance where playing around and trial and error isn't going to solve this issue. You might see other tutorials online where people do this exact same function and don't get this. This is just a weird little thing, and I have my suspicions of why it's happening, but what we do to fix it is go to Add, Input, and you can see that ID socket is green, so we want an integer. So we're going to go to Constant, Integer, plop this guy down here. And basically this ID socket is supposed to default to 0, but it isn't. So we're going to assign it 0 manually by connecting that up. You see, once we do that, our data flow is back to kind of a colorful gray into blue to indicate the change in data types there. And again, you usually don't need to do that, but if you have trouble with your random value node, that's probably the solution for you. If you roll over the socket names, you can see the value that is being passed along. In this case, it is 0.86 and change, and it is a float, which makes sense because it's set to float. And the rotation socket has 3 values that are all the same, and you can see on the far right there, it is expecting a vector data type. So basically, it's converting a floating value into a vector value. So if you don't want all your random values to be the same, what we need to do is assign a vector value instead. So when we do that, you see we've got a min and a max for both the x, well not both, all 3 x, y, and z values. And it's going from 0 to 1. So we'll go ahead and connect that up. When I do, you can see that the cube sure enough moved, but it definitely moved more than 1 degree, and that's because we're working in radians. So anytime you see a numerical value that is assigned to a rotation or an angle and it doesn't have that degree symbol, you're probably dealing in radians. I'll spare you the trip to your trigonometry book. A radian is about 57 degrees, so this rotation is somewhere between 0 and 57 degrees in all 3 axes. If you want to go 360 degrees, on a unit circle, that is 2 pi. So if you multiply 2 times pi, which is about 3.14, Comes out to 6.28, so you can type that in there. And you'll get almost all of that 360 degrees of range. 2 pi is also equal to a number referred to as tau. So you can also type in the word tau, and that will also do the job. See, it comes to 6.283. So incidentally, tau is also an irrational number. There is a group of people that want to swap in tau for the value of 2 pi in all the common circle equations, and they celebrate Tau Day instead of Pi Day, which I assume is June 28th. It's a whole thing if you want to go ahead and look into it. But otherwise, once we assign all these values to tau, we're all set with our bottom data flow. Incidentally, you could also type in pi and e. So all 3 of these are irrational values with an alphabetic value assigned to them. So there might be a few more. I'm not sure what they are. But we will leave it at that and work on framing and grouping next. So here we are with our geometry node group all laid out. The plan is to turn the top data flow into its own node group and the bottom data flow into a frame, because that would give us 2 geometry node groups. Let's go ahead and name the first one here. We'll call it parent group. Once I rename it, you can see the name changes over here in this hierarchy at the top of the editor, and it also changes over here in the properties panel. So this title here was not set in stone. If we had more node groups, we could actually swap it out with another one, but we don't at the moment. Shrink that back down. So to set these 2 nodes into their own group, what we do is select them, either by holding down Shift and clicking on them, or by drawing a box around them. And once they're selected, we go to Node, scroll down a bit. We want Make Group, and you can see the shortcut is Control-G. And once I do that, it's kind of jarring, but it takes us into a new window where it isolates those 2 nodes and also shows us their input and output nodes. So this is its own full-fledged node group now. Besides acknowledging that, there's not really much for us to do on the screen at the moment, so we're going to go back, and when we do, you see the 2 nodes have turned into one singular smaller node. If we zoom in a bit, we can see things a little bit better. We can actually rename the node group. We'll call it child group, which also renamed the node label, but we can name that individually as well. We'll call it top data flow. And we can give it its own color as well if we wanted. So just to emphasize that this is now its own geometry node group, if we go over back to the properties panel here and go to the node group dropdown, you see child group is now available. In fact, if we select it, you see it just makes the other guy disappear. We'll bring it back. Alright, so that was step 1. Our next step is to gather the bottom here into a frame, which isn't quite as powerful, but still very useful for organizational purposes. So again, what we're going to do, in fact, we'll just select 2 of the nodes for now. I'm holding down Shift, but you can draw the box around them just like before. And then once you do that, you go to Node, Join in New Frame. And once you do that, you get this black rectangle that encompasses both the nodes. You can change the color if you like. Kind of like it dark. And you can label it as well. We'll call it bottom data flow. And you see the title show up right there. Increase or decrease the label size if that is helpful. If you wanted to add a node to the frame, all you gotta do is click and drag it over. And as you can see, the rectangle will accommodate. If you want to remove a node from the frame, you can right click on it and select remove from frame. Shortcut is Alt P. And there you go. If you wanted to do away with the frame altogether, you just select the frame and you can hit X, delete, or you can use the menu. And you're back to square one. So that's a quick overview of organizing nodes into groups and frames. A few closing notes in working with the geometry node modifier. The first note is that you cannot manually edit the results of the modifier. What I mean by that is if we go to edit mode, as far as Blender is concerned, there's just a cube in its original spot in its original shape. I can't select any of the vertices, edges, or faces that resulted from the modifications. At the same time, if you did want to do some modification to the original object, you can do that. I'm going to go ahead and grab a vertice here and move it around. And as you can see, the geometry nodes are reacting to my edits in real time. If you find that the results of the modifier are getting in the way, you have a few options here. These blue icons represent display options, and the first one is edit mode. So you can go ahead and stop displaying the results of the modifier in edit mode, and then you can focus on editing the original object manually. When you're all done, you can bring it back, and what I've got there is a pretty nice little mess. Now there is an exception to editing a modified object, and that's if you destroy the modifier. So we're going to go back to object mode, and if we go next to the display options, there's this little down arrow here, and it says apply. So what that will do is apply all the results of the modifier, but then the modifier is destroyed. So I will go ahead and apply this, and as you can see, the modifier is gone. You don't see anything in the editor anymore. But if we go to the edit mode, we can go ahead and treat the object normally. So it kind of defeats the purpose of working with the geometry nodes, but there are certainly circumstances where you might want to do this. One final note, I just want to emphasize the reusability of the geometry nodes groups. So I'm going to go ahead and delete everything that's there. And let's go ahead and add a cylinder. I'm going to go into object mode. We'll go ahead and add a modifier, geometry nodes, new group. And we'll go ahead and select the child group, which, as you remember, was the group that did the extruding. And when I select that, as you can see, that can save you a whole bunch of time in a large project if you have a couple of geometry node groups that you can apply all over, let's say, a town or a landscape. Very handy. So that is all I've got for you today. I know we didn't do anything too crazy, but I kept things simple and covered the basics. And your next stop is really just learning what all the nodes do. So I hope I piqued your interest. I hope we had fun, and I hope you have a good day.